I've been predicting for several years now that there will be an exam question on Gabriel Utterson for literature paper one, incorrectly predicting that because an exam question on Utterson has not yet come up. However, I'm convinced that in the coming years, an Utterson question has to be on the paper at some point, because in my mind, Utterson is probably the most important character in the novel. So many of my students say, isn't he just that annoying, boring, irrelevant lawyer? And I hope this video will not only prepare you for an exam question on Utterson, but also convince you that he is absolutely crucial to the novel, to its message, and that he has significant symbolic value in the text. To run through some context that's relevant to Utterson's character and to the meaning that we're going to discuss here. If you want a more detailed rundown of relevant context, please do watch the Jekyll and Hyde context video that's on my channel. So the first thing that's important is that Victorian society is one which was heavily concerned with appearances, a judgmental society, and its members needed to adhere to a strict moral code. And there was a desire by characters such as Utterson in the middle and upper classes to live up to the idealized version of gentlemanly behavior. So Utterson's self-control at the start stems from his own personal desire to maintain his facade of respectability, but he is also in many ways a victim of that judgmental society. He both fears that judgment, and hides his true self from it. The next bit of relevant context is Darwin, who published his On the Origin of Species in 1859, and his theories about evolution challenged the religious beliefs of the time, particularly the belief in the creationist theory, the idea that God created the earth and all the people and animals on it. And the characters' reactions to Hyde, including Utterson, mirror in many ways Victorian society's reaction to Darwin at the time. And Utterson's refusal to acknowledge Hyde's significance seems to mirror their reluctance to accept a theory which so fundamentally challenged the ideology of the Victorian era. And finally, it's important to note that Victorian society, following on from Darwin's theories, was one which was particularly obsessed and fixated on progress. Victorian society made more moral, scientific, and industrial progress than any society that had gone before it. Hyde is therefore so repugnant and abhorrent to Victorian society, including Gabriel Utterson, because he represents he's a symbol of regression in a society which was so fixated on progress, and he forces Utterson and others to confront the possibility that they too have this primitive, darker side within themselves, and that's part of what makes him so dangerous. So it's whenever you get a character question, it's always crucial to consider what is that character's symbolic value, and how does that character allow the author to convey their message in the text, whether you're talking about Shakespeare, whether you're talking about the novel, whether you're talking about an Inspector Calls, whatever your text is, characters have symbolic value, and the authors are using them in order to create meaning and to convey messages. And Utterson is no different. He represents many of the fears of Victorian society at the time. He certainly represents those Darwinian fears, the fear of regression. He absolutely represents a fear of class transgression and the duality of the fear of the duality of Victorian society. You can see in the diagram on the right a crude representation of the Victorian class system. Now Utterson is in that second level up. He's a sort of upper middle class character, and so you can see why the fear of class transgression is so real for Utterson, because he is so close to falling into the lower classes or being usurped by the lower classes. And Utterson also represents a fear of the darkness within, And this links to Stevenson's own experience, a man who grew up in Edinburgh as the archetypal Victorian gentleman, but he also lived a dual life. By night, he would go and visit prostitutes, visit illegal drinking dens. And so Stevenson recognized both the duality of human nature and the duality of Victorian society. And in part, he uses Utterson to reveal both of those. So we start in chapter 1. It's no coincidence that Utterson is the first character that we meet, because Stevenson sets him up as a kind of representative figure for the whole of Victorian society. He absolutely embodies the Victorian moral code and fear of judgment, which kept everyone in their place. We learn on page 1 that he was austere with himself. He was never lighted by a smile. He drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages. He is a man of self-control, a man who keeps his inner desires hidden, and a man who maintains a facade of respectability in the public eye. He is afraid of judgment. He has a desire to maintain his position within the Victorian hierarchy, and so in many ways he hides his true self. He loves the theatre, but he never goes because he doesn't want to be seen as being too frivolous or adventurous. But Stevenson does hint to us, even on that opening page, that even Utterson, the most self-controlled, the representative figure for Victorian society, even he has this potential for duality within him. His affections are described as being like ivy, and that simile is important because ivy is used as a facade for buildings. It hides the imperfections underneath. And so Stevenson is hinting immediately that Utterson's facade perhaps hides imperfections within his character, and therefore Stevenson lets us know that even Utterson has the potential for something darker within him. And that becomes clear in chapter 2, because by chapter 2, Utterson has only heard about Hyde, but he immediately goes from a man of absolute self-control to a man who is starting to reveal an obsession with Hyde. His imagination was engaged, or rather enslaved. He had an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of Mr. Hyde. He began to haunt the door of Hyde and would camp out by his door, desperate to meet him. This is a far cry from the man who was never lighted by a smile and austere with himself and drank gin when he was alone in chapter 1. So immediately, Utterson starts to reveal this darker side to himself. And this is part of the journey that Stevenson takes him on to reveal that all characters, including the most archetypal Victorian gentleman, has this potential for darkness within them. This is particularly clear in Utterson's dream in chapter 2. He has this kind of nightmare about Hyde, where Hyde is rampaging around town, trampling on young girls and going into the bedroom of Dr. Jekyll. Significantly, in his dream, Hyde is described as that human juggernaut. And that metaphor contrasts very nicely with the simile from chapter 1, where Hyde is described as being like some damned juggernaut. In chapter 1, he is the mythical being, the damned juggernaut. He can be dismissed as a myth, as an animal. By chapter 2, he's a human juggernaut. Utterson is already subconsciously recognizing that Hyde has humanity within him. And if he recognizes that Hyde has humanity within him, he also has to subconsciously recognize the potential for him to have a Hyde inside himself. So Utterson is already subconsciously perhaps recognizing the darkness that may live within inside him. In chapter 4, Hyde's threat becomes particularly pertinent. He murders Sir Danvers Carew in a brutal attack. And we can see that Hyde's influence on the novel, his power is increasing. He's gone from someone who trampled calmly on the young girl in chapter 1 to now a man or a being who broke out of all bounds and broke out in a great flame of anger. And that repetition of broke out reveals that Hyde is breaking free from the bounds of Victorian civility. He's breaking free from the restraints of the Victorian moral code. And this is terrifying for Utterson and other members of society, because it is that moral code which keeps Utterson and others in their place. It is that moral code which differentiates Utterson from the lower working classes. And without that moral code, Utterson's place in Victorian society is no longer assured. The flame here is an interesting metaphor for Hyde because it shows it's something which starts small but has the potential to spread if not acknowledged or managed properly. And so here is a sign for Utterson and others that not just Hyde, but what Hyde represents, the darkness within mankind and the darkness within society, also has the potential to spread. And they all have the potential to become part of it. So after the murder, what Utterson sees and Utterson's reaction is really interesting. Utterson sees a great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven and a glow of a rich lurid brown. It's really interesting that for Utterson now, the darkness has become something appealing. It's described as being chocolate-coloured, something sweet. It's described as being, even though it's brown, it's glowing. The darkness is perhaps appealing for Utterson now because actually Hyde is appealing to Utterson, because Hyde has freedom from the moral code. Hyde has freedom from the restraints of Victorian society. And perhaps subconsciously, Utterson desires that too. A man who fears judgment, a man who keeps his inner reality hidden away, perhaps sees Hyde as something to aspire to, not intentionally, but certainly subconsciously. And we see darkness starting to win the battle over light, and therefore evil is winning the battle over good. The daylight is described as being haggard, the daylight is tired, and the darkness is described as being a reinvasion. And I think that word reinvasion is really interesting, because not only does it show darkness as being a threat, but it shows that darkness has been there before. Perhaps it's always been there. It is not something new. This darkness, this evil, already existed within society and already existed within the people of Victorian society, including Utterson. And then you get this wonderful moment where the fog lifts. Now, the fog is a symbol perhaps for Utterson's denial. It allows Utterson to deny the truth of what Hyde is and the truth of the duality of Victorian society. And when that fog lifts, Utterson sees for the first time in the novel London's dual nature, because he can no longer just live in the pristine middle-class streets that he frequents, but he is forced to see the dismal quarter of Soho, this place of immorality, this place of lower class, and he's forced to acknowledge that actually his middle-class London is so close to the immoral lower-class London that he wants to keep hidden. It's the slatternly passengers as he sees them. And so for Utterson, London becomes like the district of some city in a nightmare, this nightmarish vision of class transgression, where there is the potential for the lower immorality of the lower classes to mix with the gentlemanly behaviour of the middle classes to which Utterson belongs. It's worth looking at. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, Charles Booth's map of London, because what it shows in its colour-coded format is that London was a place where actually the lower class populations lived in such close proximity to the middle and upper classes. There is not as much to divide them as the middle classes would want to believe. And that is perhaps Utterson's greatest fear. And it's in chapter 7 where we start to see again that potential for the dark side in Utterson starting to emerge. Because him and Enfield are out for a walk and they see Jekyll at his window. They engage in conversation. But then they witness the smile was struck from Jekyll's face and replaced by a look of such abject terror and despair. What they are seeing here is the start of the transformation of Jekyll into Hyde. And instead of being there for their friend and helping him and supporting him, they turn away. They turned and left the court without a word. God forgive us, they say, God forgive us. Now, this is a far cry from the man who in chapter 1 is described as the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men, a man who should stay loyal to his friends in their time of need. Yet in Jekyll's greatest moment of need, Utterson walks away. It seems to me that his fear of judgment and his fear of disgrace is much stronger than his loyalty to his friend. And so in this moment, Utterson not only becomes a symbol for the potential darkness in mankind, he also becomes a symbol for the hypocrisy of the Victorian moral code and the hypocrisy of the Victorian facade of respectability. And in chapter 8, we finally see that darkness emerging in Utterson undeniably. He goes to Jekyll's house at the request of Jekyll's butler Poole, because they fear that Jekyll has been kidnapped and replaced by someone who is Edward Hyde. And Utterson goes with Poole to the cabinet door and he says, "Jekyll," cried Utterson with a loud voice, "I demand to see you. I must and shall see you, if not by your consent, then by brute force." Those imperative verbs and that aggressive language reveal a man who was completely changed from the man who was austere with himself and never lighted by a smile. His behaviour is almost animalistic now, in the same way that Hyde's behaviour is animalistic. And then they break down the cabinet door, and how Stevenson describes it is interesting. He says the blow shook the building and the red baize door leaped against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech as of mere animal terror rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. Now the verb choices here, shook, leaped, bounded, crashed, burst. This isn't like the murder of chapter 4, where Hyde murders Carew, but the verb choices here in many ways mirror the actions of Hyde in chapter 4. And so Stevenson is telling us that then he's not saying that Utterson and Poole are murderers, but he's drawing a parallel certainly between Utterson and Hyde. Utterson and Hyde are not so different as Utterson would like to believe. And so Stevenson uses Utterson in this moment to reveal to us that everyone, even Utterson, has the potential for this darkness, for this Hyde to live within themselves. And for that reason, perhaps, once they've broken down the door and they stand there and contemplate what they've done, they're described as being the besiegers who are appalled by their own riot. Besiegers, they are attackers, they are aggressive, and they're appalled, perhaps because they've been forced to recognize this darkness within themselves for the first time. But appalled also tells us that they feel a sense of shame. They are still bound by the Victorian moral code. So Utterson not only reveals the potential for darkness, but he also reveals the strength of the expectation that exists in Victorian society. Even in this moment of rebellion, he is still bound by his duty to the Victorian moral code. And I just want to finish by reaffirming that Stevenson uses Utterson and the other characters in the novel to highlight that we all have this darker element, this potential for duality in our characters. Utterson, as we've already seen, goes from this vision of self-control to a man who begins to haunt the door, to a man who breaks down a cabinet door in chapter 8. Sawbones, the doctor in chapter 1, goes from someone emotional as a bagpipe to someone who immediately turns sick and white with a desire to kill. Lanyon, a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman, becomes someone whose flesh had fallen away, who has their death warrant written upon their face, and who possesses a deep-seated terror of the mind. Everyone, and nobody more than Utterson, reveals Stevenson's message that we all have to accept, that there is a duality both in Victorian society and Victorians themselves.